On a quiet evening in May 2023, the phone rang incessantly at the beach house in California. Sandra Reynolds, a schoolteacher in her early 40s, hurried to pick up the receiver. Her heart sank as she heard the news. A terrible car accident had claimed the life of her husband, John. As shock and disbelief washed over her, she could only stare blankly at the phone, her world shattering around her. Little did she know that the truth about John's secret life was about to emerge, forcing her to confront a complex legacy of love, loss, and betrayal. Meanwhile, in a different city, Linda Henderson, the mother of Sarah, John's secret child, received a call from the hospital. Her heart raced as she listened to the news. John had been involved in a fatal accident. As she tried to process the news, she recalled how they had made plans to be together, how they had dreamed of a future together, and how those dreams had been shattered when John had returned to his wife and family. Now, as she prepared to face the consequences of John's double life, she wondered how she would explain everything to Sarah, the daughter they had together when they were much younger. John's next of kin, for reasons John took with him when he died, had been Linda and Sandra. He never could have guessed that this day would bring such sadness. Not only from John's horrific death, but the realization that John was leading a double life, a life with another woman that also had John's child too. As Sandra and Linda made their way to the hospital, their minds reeled with the implications of John's death. They had each been told that 2 people were listed as the next of kin, but they hadn't been told who the other person was or how they were connected to John. As Sandra arrived at the hospital, she led to a small room where a member of the hospital staff came in and sat down next to Sandra, holding a clipboard. She explained the causes of John's death and what would happen now to Sandra. But Sandra couldn't take it all in. She was completely lost without John. Sandra became suddenly aware that the woman was mentioning another name. She didn't know who would also be given the same paperwork as Sandra. Sandra asked the woman to repeat what she had just said, and her whole world spun as she was informed John had named another woman as his next of kin also, and that she would also need to attend the hospital. Sandra was then left alone in the room to wait for another member of staff to come and collect her. Meanwhile, in another small room, Linda was being given the same information. However, she knew John had a wife, so she had expected this, and was terrified of the other woman's response. She almost wished he had not named her as next of kin, and left her to deal with the consequences alone. She was led out into the hallway, where another woman was also waiting with red eyes, and Linda instantly knew that it was John's wife, the woman they had both betrayed. Sandra looked up and saw Linda. Her heart almost stopped as she was confronted with the woman her husband had also been sharing his life with. She was too numb to react and stood silently waiting. The 2 women, who had once been strangers connected only by the man they loved, now found themselves bound by the complex web of secrets and lies that John had spun. They exchanged hesitant glances, unsure of how to approach each other, each carrying their own burden of grief and anger. They were led to the morgue where they identified John's body. As they stood there, staring at the lifeless form of the man they had loved, they couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal. Sandra felt a deep well of rage boiling inside her, while Linda's heart ached with the realization that her dreams of a future with John were nothing more than fantasies. In the midst of their grief and confusion, the hospital staff informed them that there was another family member who needed to be notified. This revelation only added to the mounting tension between Sandra and Linda. As they waited, they found themselves sitting together in a small waiting room, unable to escape the awkward silence that hung between them. Sandra tried to maintain her composure, but the anger and hurt she felt threatened to spill over. Linda, on the other hand, felt a sense of guilt for her part in John's deception. The door to the waiting room swung open, and a young woman with a rebellious spirit walked in. She had her mother's striking features and John's piercing eyes. It was Sarah, John's secret child. Seeing the woman who claimed to be her father's wife, she felt a mix of confusion and anger. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling with emotion. Sandra and Linda exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to respond. It was clear that Sarah was angry and hurt, and they couldn't blame her. After all, they were in the same boat. "I'm Sandra," Sandra finally said, extending her hand hesitantly. "I'm John's wife." Linda looked away, unable to meet Sandra's gaze. She knew that this was going to be a difficult conversation, and she wasn't sure how to navigate the waters of deceit and betrayal that lay ahead. "John never told me about you," Sandra continued, her voice quivering with emotion. "I had no idea he had another family." Linda remained silent, her heart heavy with the burden of her own secrets. She glanced at Sarah, who was still visibly shaken by the revelation. "Look, I don't know what to say," Sandra began, her voice cracking. "I'm just as shocked as you are. I had no idea he was leading a double life." Sandra's words hung in the air, echoing the confusion and betrayal that reverberated between the three of them. Linda took a deep breath, trying to find the courage to speak. "I understand how you feel, Sarah," she said softly. "Your father and I were in love once, but he chose to keep our relationship secret from his family. We never meant to hurt anyone." Sandra shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I don't know why he did any of this," she murmured. "He was a good man, but he kept so many secrets." Linda bit her lip, fighting back tears. "He was a good man," she echoed softly. Sandra nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Yes, he was," she agreed. Suddenly the door to the waiting room swung open, and a man in a suit walked in. He introduced himself as John's lawyer and explained that he had some important documents for Sandra and Linda to review. As they followed the man down the hall, the gravity of the situation hit them like a ton of bricks. They were about to learn the truth about John's double life, and it wasn't going to be pretty. In a small conference room, the lawyer handed them each a manila envelope containing documents related to John's will and financial affairs. As they sat there, poring over the papers, they couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief. John had left behind a complex web of lies and deceit, and they were left to untangle the mess he had created. Sandra and Linda spent the next few hours going over the documents, trying to make sense of John's decisions. As they worked through the details, they discovered that John had set up trust funds for both families, ensuring their financial security in the event of his death. Despite the provisions he had made, they couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal. John had kept them apart for so long, and now they were forced to confront the consequences of his actions. As they left the office, they couldn't help but feel a deep sense of loss and confusion. Back at the beach house, Sandra and Linda sat together in the living room, trying to find some common ground. They were both grieving the loss of the man they loved and struggling to come to terms with the reality of his double life. Despite their initial awkwardness, they found themselves opening up to each other, sharing stories and memories of John. "He was such a private person," Sandra admitted, her voice trembling. "I never suspected anything. He always came home with stories of work trips and conferences. I had no idea he was seeing someone else." Linda nodded in understanding. "I knew it was wrong, but we had Sarah, and we tried but struggled to break the bond between us. We had our ups and downs, but we were in love," Linda continued, her voice catching in her throat. "I knew he loved you too, but I just couldn't let him go." Sandra listened quietly, trying to process the unimaginable information. She had always known that John was distant and reserved, but she never suspected that he had another family. "I don't know what to say," she murmured. "I'm just as shocked." Linda nodded, wiping away a tear. "I understand," she said softly. "We both loved him, and now we have to deal with the consequences of his choices." As they sat there, lost in their thoughts, Sarah entered the room. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying, and she looked lost and confused. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I don't know what to do," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sandra and Linda exchanged glances. They knew that Sarah was hurting, but they didn't know how to comfort her or help her navigate the complex emotions she was feeling when they were struggling to come to terms with everything themselves. "We're here for you, Sarah," Sandra said gently. "Whatever you need, we'll do our best to help." Linda nodded in agreement. "Your father loved you very much, Sarah," she said, her voice cracking, "and we'll always be here for you." Sandra reached out to Sarah, offering her a tissue. "We can talk about anything you want to talk about," she said, trying to sound reassuring. Linda nodded in agreement, her eyes filled with sympathy. "You're part of our family now, Sarah," Sandra said softly, "and we'll do everything we can to help you through this." Sarah looked at them both, taking in their words and the unspoken understanding between them. A weight seemed to lift from her shoulders as she realized that she wasn't alone in her grief. "Thank you," she managed, her voice still shaky. The three of them sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Sarah remembered the time she had spent with her father, the laughter they shared, the late-night conversations they had about life and dreams. Sandra remembered the day she had met John, the way he had made her feel like the most special person in the world. Linda remembered the passionate love they had shared, the promises they had made to each other. Sarah stared at a photo of her mother and father that Linda had always carried in her purse. She needed to know more about their relationship now. She needed the truth, and she believed Sandra did too. She decided to confront her mother about the photo, hoping to gain some insight into her father's past. Sarah had studied psychology, hoping to better understand the complexities of human relationships and the motivations behind their actions. She hoped she could use her knowledge to help her new extended family through these difficult times. Linda was taken aback when Sarah asked her to be honest with them all about her relationship with her father, but she could understand why it would need to be explained, and out in the open. Too many lies had already been told, and she should be honest with her daughter. She explained that the photo was taken when she and John had met at college years ago. Their attraction to each other had been undeniable. They had begun their relationship, which eventually led to Sarah's birth. She didn't know much about John's life before he met her, but she knew he had been involved with another woman before they were together. She had always suspected there might be another woman, but she never imagined it would be this complicated. Linda found out that John was married the day that Linda told John about being pregnant. He was completely destroyed, and so was I, said Linda. As Sarah looked at her mother, she felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, but also a sense of understanding and empathy towards her mother. Obviously, her mother didn't know about Sandra, but her father had come clean when he had found out her mother was pregnant. Linda explained that they had made a pact to never let anyone know about the pregnancy. John had been so distraught at his own actions that he vowed to look after Sarah and Linda no matter what. John was at the end of his degree and was highly respected. Also, Sandra's father was retiring, and John was in line to take over his accountancy firm, explained Linda to Sarah. It made sense at the time to just go our separate ways, no matter how heartbreaking it was for Linda at the time. Although, when Sarah was born, he was so devastated he wouldn't see her grow up that Linda said he was welcome to see her any time he wanted. Of course, he kept coming to see her and staying over, and eventually it turned into love between Linda and John again. It was a never-ending circle of John leading a double life, a life that eventually killed him. After college, Linda had moved to another state, hoping to start a new life for herself and Sarah. Sarah tried to process this new information. She felt a mix of emotions: anger, betrayal, sadness, but also a sense of understanding and empathy towards her parents. They had all been caught up in a web of lies and deceit, and it had taken a tragic event for her mother to finally confront the truth, and indeed, tell Sarah the truth. Sarah wondered about her father back then, when he was at college. She wondered if her mum getting pregnant was what her dad had really wanted. Though heartbreaking, she knew that it wouldn't have been. She realized that this whole situation could have been different if her mum Linda had kept away from a married man. Sarah began to get angry inside, thinking she had just been a mistake perhaps, and if it hadn't been for her, her dad wouldn't have died. If it hadn't been for her, her dad John wouldn't have had to lead a double life. Sarah also wondered how Sandra would take the news of her mother's wrongdoing that had in part led to all this complicated situation. As Sarah processed the information, she realized that her anger was misplaced. She understood that her father's actions were his own doing, and she couldn't hold her mother responsible for them. Instead, she focused on the man she had lost and the life they could have had together if he hadn't been so confused about Sandra and Linda. Sarah couldn't help but wonder how long her mother and father would have kept all this a secret from her, and how they ever imagined they could. But nevertheless, she forgave Linda. Sandra had listened to Linda describe her relationship with John, and she knew she would have to try to accept that her husband had led a double life. She also believed that he had loved her. He had loved them both, and so she would have to learn to accept this to be able to move on from the pain and anger she had felt. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, they all felt a sense of peace wash over them. They knew that their lives would never be the same again, but they also knew that they had each other to lean on. Slowly, they began to talk about their memories of John, sharing stories and laughter. Despite the pain they were all feeling, they found solace in the knowledge that they weren't alone. In the days that followed, Sarah had been told about her half-brother and sister. This was another revelation to Sarah, but it seemed to make her look at life from a different perspective. Sarah settled into life with her new family. She got to know her half-siblings, Michael and Lily, who were going through their own disbelief and grief. Somehow the truth coming out about John's double life had brought the grieving children some solace in the fact that they had other family members that were going through their own troubled times. They bonded over shared memories of their father. Sandra and Linda spent time together, learning about each other and trying to understand the complex web of emotions they were all feeling. They realized that they had more in common than they thought, and they began to form a tentative friendship. Meanwhile, the world around them continued to turn. Life went on, and they had to find a way to navigate the new reality they were facing. They attended John's funeral, surrounded by friends and family who were all trying to come to terms with his death. Sandra and Linda stood side by side as they said their final goodbyes to the man they both loved. As they stood there, looking at the crowd of people who had come to pay their respects, they knew that they would never be the same again. In the weeks and months that followed, they all struggled to adjust to their new lives. Sarah had to deal with the shock of discovering she had a secret half-sibling and family. She had to navigate the complex relationships between her mother, Sandra, and step-siblings, while also dealing with the grief of losing her father. Sandra and Linda found themselves drawn together, sharing their memories of John and trying to support each other through their grief. They formed a bond that neither of them could have predicted, built on the foundation of their shared love for John. Meanwhile, Michael and Lily were also struggling to come to terms with their father's double life. They had to confront the fact that their parents' marriage wasn't as perfect as they had thought, and that their father had been keeping secrets from them. It was a difficult journey for all of them, but they learned to lean on each other for support. As they grew closer as a family, they began to understand that their father's deception had brought them all together in unexpected ways. The revelation about John's secret life also had a ripple effect on their community. Friends and neighbors were shocked and saddened by the news, and many struggled to come to terms with the fact that someone they knew and trusted had been leading a double life. Some were angry, while others were sympathetic. As time passed, the community came together to support Sandra, Linda, and their children, offering love and support in the face of tragedy. Sandra and Linda decided to turn their pain into purpose by starting a support group for families affected by similar situations. They reached out to other families who had experienced the shock and betrayal of discovering a loved one's secret life. Together, they shared their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs. They offered each other comfort and understanding, knowing that no one else could truly understand what they were going through, except someone who had been through it themselves. As Sarah became more involved in the support group, she realized that she wasn't alone in her feelings of confusion and anger. She met other children who had also discovered that they had half-siblings they never knew existed. They shared their experiences of navigating their new relationships, learning about their siblings, and trying to make sense of their parents' decisions. Through these connections, Sarah began to accept her new reality and even found a sense of belonging within her expanded family. Inspired by their own experiences and the need for guidance and support in similar situations, Sandra and Linda decided to turn their story into a book. They poured their hearts into writing, sharing their journey of grief, betrayal, and eventual healing. They wanted to provide a resource for others who might be going through similar struggles, offering hope and understanding in the midst of pain. Their book became an instant bestseller, touching the hearts of millions of readers around the world. People from all walks of life reached out to Sandra and Linda, expressing their gratitude for their courage and honesty. They received letters and emails from families who had been torn apart by secrets and lies, sharing their stories and seeking advice. Sandra and Linda continued to run the support group, offering guidance and understanding to those who needed it. They became advocates for families affected by similar situations, speaking out about the importance of honesty and communication. Their message resonated with people everywhere, inspiring them to confront the difficult truths in their own double lives and to seek help when they needed it. They had become a family in their own right. They were bonded through the pain and betrayal they all felt so deeply. They were bonded together by the same man who they all loved dearly. He had loved them all, and now they all shared a love for each other. It was a complex situation, but they were family, and whilst the pain of the betrayal remained, it was no longer a barrier between them. It was a bridge, and they were family. It would be great if you could like and subscribe to the channel, and also give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Have an enjoyable and enlightening time, and we hope to see you again.